never slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up.
Channel Narra needs your financial support from the moment this episode is released. Channel and ARS fundraising campaign officially begins, and we are ready to receive your contributions. We will also publish the various ways to donate and an explanation of this campaign on platforms like Facebook, Telegram, and Twitter to make them accessible to everyone. We won't talk much more about the campaign now. We'll go straight to this episode's program. The Rwandan Genocide. This 14th episode of Music is about the Rwandan Genocide. Rwanda is a small country in Central Africa where, in the first half of the 1990s, more than 20 years ago, an event occurred for which the country is now known. In the spring and early summer of 1994, during a widespread massacre, the Republic of Rwanda was decimated. The killings were, technically speaking, low-tech. They were mostly carried out with machetes and daggers. However, their speed was astonishing. In less than 100 days, at least 800,000 people out of Rwanda's 7 million population were killed, mostly with machetes and daggers. The Hutu majority began killing Tutsis in early April 1994. A month later, they were saying that it was easier to find a dead Tutsi than a living one in Rwanda. This continued until July, when the rebel army occupied Rwanda and the killing stopped. In October of the same year, the UN declared the mass murder and extermination, which was planned, systematic, and methodical, carried out by these Hutus, a genocide. Audiences of Western media, including us, mostly learned about this story through one or two prolific journalists who covered the events from the beginning, traveling to Rwanda repeatedly and writing about it. This act, carried out by the government, was usually referred to as cleansing or work, or the bloody massacres in former Yugoslavia or the Holocaust didn't even come close to the Rwandan genocide in terms of the rate of killing. After this, Hutu extremists began to suspect that the president himself might be complicit with these traitors, and they alienated him. They learned about it through their lens. Habyarimana was the president for 20 years. The article explained that he would be assassinated by Hutus hired by the cockroaches. If you can tolerate these confusing names, they will gradually become familiar. I'll try to explain it in a way that helps us not get confused. Not only that, even Hutus who opposed Hutu power were considered accomplices. The next day, the radio announced that the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the rebel group of Tutsis formed in exile, was responsible for the assassination. In reality, it was a military sabotage that the government blamed on them. Thomas, of course, didn't believe it. If he were the kind of person to believe such things, he would have been reading that very news on the radio himself behind the microphone. "We will kill them ourselves," it had begun. On April 12th, Thomas received a call to come to the office. A former colleague of his had become the Minister of Information, replacing a murdered opponent, and they showed it to me. Your name was on the list. Thomas himself was a Hutu, but he wasn't particularly surprised that his name was on the list. When he was a radio announcer, he didn't propagate the Hutu power ideology. He didn't play by their rules. He was a member of the Social Democratic Party, which had ties to the Rwandan Patriotic Front. He had led 2 strikes there and was from the South, a city known for its moderate politics. This person told him he had to return to work. After some insistence and denial, Thomas eventually said, "Give me an official letter. Appoint me, and I'll come." The minister agreed. Subsequently, a popular mobilization of Hutu youth was formed for civil defense. the massacre of Tutsis, and the assassination of Tutsi leaders, which gradually accelerated. He had just resigned from his job after 10 years, protesting the biased programming on state radio and television. It was also his birthday, and his wife, Jacqueline, had baked him a cake. The next morning, 3 soldiers came looking for him, threatening that his family would be in trouble if he didn't go with them. He said, "I didn't know him, but he knew me. I never understood how or where he came from, but this person truly saved me. They didn't kill him that day. They let him go." Later, he was abducted and released 2 or 3 more times, interrogated and released elsewhere. The writer believes that there wasn't much organization behind these events. From Thomas's story, the writer concludes that the events were largely spontaneous. They took him to a place where he was first interrogated about sending news to foreign media, and then beaten, punched, kicked, and cursed. Finally, they forced him to write a will, telling him they were going to kill him. As he was taking a shower, Jacqueline started banging on the door, shouting, "Come out! The president has been killed." The president was returning from Tanzania on a plane when it was shot down. Apparently, no one survived. Within hours, the Hutu youth militia had barricaded the capital city of Kigali. Death squads were sent after Tutsi leaders, including the prime minister, who was a Tutsi, unlike other government officials who were Hutus. The next day, 10 Belgian UN peacekeepers who had arrived after the internal peace treaty were also killed. This act deterred the UN and other international organizations from further intervention. Foreign countries understood the situation and prioritized evacuation. They occupied a part of the country, declaring their intention to end Hutu power. He had heard rumors that those close to the president were planning a mass killing, and even a list of Hutu opponents was prepared for the first wave of killings. But he never guessed that this wave might not even spare Habyarimana himself, that the president would also fall victim to the plot. He then wondered, if he's not safe, who is? Hutu power was the name given to the ruling ideology within the Hutu political system. One of them is a guy named Phillip Gourev. The main source for this part of Channel Narra is a report he wrote in December 1995, titled, "We wish to inform you that tomorrow we will be killed with our families," published in The New Yorker. If I'm not mistaken, it was the first detailed report about the Rwandan Genocide. I'll describe this report, and then towards the end of the podcast, I'll move on to a more recent report. In '93, the peace agreement was signed, and then some people started saying that the president's actions were suspicious. In January 1994, a Hutu extremist newspaper wrote, "Let this fire under the ashes flare up, for then much blood will be shed." Most Rwandans couldn't afford to buy newspapers, nor could they read them, but this message reached the ears it needed to reach. I'll introduce that one when I get to it, explaining its story, who wrote it, and where it was published. Decimation and its horrifying speed decimation means that for every 10 people in a place, 1 is killed. To compare its speed, for example, Pol Pot killed 1 million people in Cambodia, but over 4 years. Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda, there was a Hutu majority and a Tutsi minority. The Hutus had started the massacres in the late 1950s after Rwanda gained independence from Belgian colonialism and had continued them intermittently. The spark of conflict. The real spark for the major conflict occurred in 1990 when the Rwandan Patriotic Front, led by a group of exiled Tutsis, attacked from Uganda in northeastern Rwanda. The Hutu ruling class quickly labeled their opponents Inyenzi and stated that anyone of the same race as these, Inyenzi, was also complicit. The road to catastrophe. In August 1993, the Rwandan president signed a peace and power-sharing agreement with the RPF. Remember the dates. In the early 90s, the events began. In March of the same year, a newspaper ran the headline, "Habyarimana will die." The turning point. April 6, 1994 now. Picture this. On April 6, 1994, a 30-year-old radio announcer named Thomas Kamilindi came home in high spirits. Thomas came out and quickly locked the door. He didn't leave the house. The escalation of violence, he didn't leave his house for a week, only collecting news from around the country by phone and transmitting it to a French radio station. The radio announcer openly declared, "We will not let you kill the cockroaches." Thomas's ordeal. When Thomas returned home, his wife told him. 2 soldiers came, they had a hit list. That night, he decided he needed to find a safe place to hide. As he thought it was over, someone got out of a jeep and called out his name. He said, "I didn't know him, but he knew me. I never understood how or where he came from, but this person truly saved me." They didn't kill him that day. They let him go. Later, he was abducted and released 2 or 3 more times, interrogated, and released elsewhere. The writer believes that there wasn't much organization behind these events. From Thomas's story, the writer concludes that the events were largely spontaneous. The unseen success of genocide Thomas ultimately survived. He wasn't killed. I won't tell his whole story as it's not directly relevant to the main narrative, but he survived. However, the writer says that these people were trained and told that killing was not a crime during this period of genocide. In fact, killing was no longer a crime during the genocide. It had been transformed into a responsibility for all citizens. Therefore, if someone who was meant to be killed escaped one group, there was no guarantee that another would not seize them the next day and kill them. They could be caught on the street, put in a car, and killed, because everyone was responsible. Thomas himself faced death squads 3 or 4 times in the following weeks, and each time they told him, "Next time, you're dead." But miraculously, he wasn't killed. With the encouragement of Hutu political and ethnic leaders, killing spread throughout the country. Hutus attacked their Tutsi neighbors' homes and began killing them. They killed their Tutsi colleagues, priests killed members of their local churches, and teachers killed their friends. Many of the largest massacres took place in churches and sports stadiums, where Tutsis had often sought refuge at the invitation of local officials. These same officials, however, supervised the killings. In a very famous and heartbreaking incident in mid-April, close to 5,000 people were gathered in a stadium in Kigali. First, they were shot in a zigzag pattern, then grenades were thrown among them, causing the crowd to scatter in all directions. Then, machete-wielding individuals poured into the stadium to finish the job. Throughout the country, this slaughter was accompanied by mass rapes and looting. To try and harden these killing groups between their operations in different cities, drugs and banana beer were consumed. Hutu prisoners were dispatched to collect bodies, and the killings were ordered. One radio announcement urged people to pay attention to the animals, cattle, and rotten remains of the people who have been killed, the pregnant women who have been killed. As an incentive, Tutsi properties were pre-divided: furniture, radios, cows, and goats. If there was a young girl, she was for rape. A woman from one of Kigali's districts, who was Hutu, had said that she would pay the equivalent of 30 cents for each severed head, a practice then called cabbage selling. Rwanda after the genocide. The writer says, "I went to Rwanda for the first time a year after these events, wanting to see how the country would cope and move forward after such a thing. One thing he observed was that what was lost there was not just the killed. When the massacres began, the Rwandan Patriotic Front also resumed its war. Then 2 million Hutus, who had killed Tutsis at the command of political leaders and radio broadcasters, fled and went into exile. 2 million people, the fastest mass migration in modern history. They say that on one day, 250,000 people crossed a bridge to reach Tanzania. 1 million people went to Zaire in 1 week. This emptying of the field ultimately enabled the RPF's victory. However, This victory couldn't be complete because these hundreds of thousands of displaced people who had sought refuge in neighboring countries set up camps just across the border, armed themselves with whatever they had, and prepared for battle. It was a strange situation. Their presence there and their absence from the country reminded the victorious Tutsi forces who had taken control of the country that the game was not over. But the Tutsis who now held the country were in a difficult situation. Tea factories and coffee farms, the country's main sources of income, were destroyed. Power and telephone lines were cut. The water supply system was disrupted. In many places, bodies were even stuck in canals and water passages. The writer says, "When I was in Rwanda, I saw mass graves still being discovered a year and a half after the genocide ended. I saw people with marks and wounds on their bodies and faces. I saw these, but they weren't signs of genocide to me. They were signs of war." What truly transformed it into what it was were the stories these people told. As one of them said, the most frequently asked question everyone asks themselves is, why did I survive? The devastating success of the genocide. When the RPF government took power in July 1994, 75% of Rwanda's Tutsi population had been wiped out. In effect, the genocide had succeeded. It wasn't like saying someone died by fate or by accident. If someone survived, they would say it was their destiny to live. One of the new regime's officials told the writer, 18 people were killed in my house. 647 people were killed in my neighborhood. They had records of everyone. They wrote in red on the doors of marked houses how many people had been killed there. My wife was at her friend's house. They stormed in, killed her friend, and she miraculously survived. Everyone else was killed. The rest of my wife's 65-member family, too. This official himself was in hiding, mostly fleeing from one place to another, and survived. The writer talks to many people. Some had fled to areas under the control of the opposition. Some were lucky and were saved by a neighbor or someone. One of them says that Rwandan culture is a culture of fear. This genocide had been going on for a long time, and this fear had destroyed everyone. By the time they came for us, we had been dead for a long time. That's why no one said, "Don't kill." Everyone pleaded, "Let us die at home, not in the street." Or, "Let me pray one last time." A lawyer says, "I was tired. First, I fled and all that, but then I was genuinely exhausted from struggling and hopeless, just waiting for death." The unsettling questions. Important questions naturally arise in people's minds, such as how so many Tutsis allowed themselves to be killed, or how so many Hutus allowed themselves to kill in such a way. One person says, "Our culture is one of obedience and compliance." These are very strong, and naturally it becomes obedience to power, subservience to power. They armed an uneducated, poor society and told them, "Kill and it's yours." In a town near the Tanzanian border, over 1,000 people were gathered in a church. We will hear a personal story about this event from another article. At least 1,000 people were gathered in a church, and then they were slaughtered with machetes. The scenes described by the writer in this report are incredibly heartbreaking, and I will not repeat them here. If anyone wishes, the link is available to read it for themselves. The summary is that throughout the day, people are killed there, and then at night, they are harmed in such a way that they cannot escape, and the killers go to rest. The next day, they come back and resume. The complexity of cruelty, one of the survivors from that town says, but a doctor named Richard Malika, director of the Harvard program in refugee trauma, says the issue isn't that simple. A very important question arises. Why do people continue to severely brutalize their opponents even after achieving their political goals and gaining dominance? Why do they skin their opponents after winning? Why do they rape women? A 5-minute rape can destroy a family for a generation. We are talking about a country here. This gentleman says, My opinion is that the psychology of young men is very complex, and such crimes are committed by young men all over the world. Young men become easily dependent on power, subservient to power, and they seek validation. They are promised a position in the hierarchy as a reward, and they are made to believe that they are building heaven on earth. In most of these bloodbaths, there is a utopian dream, a more prosperous, pure, healthier, more advanced, more pure society. He says young people are very idealistic, and power targets this very aspect of them, connecting with their idealistic nature. Now, let me say something outside of this report. I once read something very similar from a seasoned journalist who had reported from war zones for decades. I don't remember his name. I'd have to search a bit to find where it was, but his words stayed with me. He had said, "I've been to many places in the world, seen many wars, seen these terrorist groups. And the conclusion I've reached is that this violence, these killings, are less rooted in religion or nationality or such things. The story is that a group of young men got their hands on weapons." He said this was the common thread in many of these tragedies. If I find who it was and where it was, I'll put it in my notes. I think I can find it. Justification and collective responsibility. Let's return to Dr. Malika's article. He also makes another interesting point. He says, "Many of us believe that someone who kills can no longer sleep soundly." He says, "On the contrary, I haven't heard of such a thing. In fact, someone who kills can usually justify it to themselves after a while, especially if they did it with the support of the government. No one knows how many Rwandans were needed to butcher close to 1 million of their compatriots. No one could have predicted how many people would be needed to carry out such a plan. The people themselves were the weapons for this work, and this meant that the entire Hutu population had to be called upon to kill the entire Tutsi community. This tactic, besides bringing obvious numerical superiority, also had the added advantage of dissolving responsibility. If everyone is an accomplice, then crime loses its specific meaning. The dilemma of a former official, a former government official who is now the Minister of Justice of the Rwandan government in exile. When I say now, remember we are talking about a year after the events, as this article I am describing was written and published in 1995, meaning it was with this report that the world understood what had happened in Rwanda, says that this situation was a state of war. In war, you cannot be neutral. You either defend your country or you are complicit with the aggressors against your country. This individual, however, was a prominent human rights activist in the early 1990s. In 1992, during a brief period when he was Minister of Justice, he even ordered the arrest of a Hutu ideologue who had called for the ethnic cleansing of Tutsis. He ordered his arrest, but nevertheless, the genocide occurred, and after the genocide, he fled to Zaire, where he now holds a ministerial post in the government in exile. In his interview with the writer, he says that this was not a normal war. It was as if the enemy was everywhere. He also states that he does not accept the UN's designation of it as a genocide. He believes it was a crime, an event where mass murders occurred that qualify as war crimes or crimes against humanity, but not genocide. He argues that Tutsis were not killed for being Tutsis. Their guilt was complicity with the Rwandan Patriotic Front. They were killed in war. He then says, of course, 99% of Tutsis were members of the RPF, meaning there was no difference between their ethnicity and their political affiliation. The writer says he asked him, "Even women and children?" He replied, "Look, when Germany attacked France, the French understood that all of Germany was fighting France. All of Germany was the enemy. Germans also killed women and children, so France also kills because it's war. All of Germany, all of France." This person's name is also on the list of those who were in power during the genocide and should face trial. Regarding his own trial, he says that those on that list, even if they are taken to an international court and even if they are convicted, will be heroes because they saved their nation's lives. If it weren't for them, we would all be dead now. Historical context. Hutu and Tutsi origins now. Let's briefly look at the historical background of Rwanda and these two tribes. These two tribes or groups are among the earliest human groups to settle in Rwanda. However, over centuries, they intermingled so much through marriage, shared language, and racial mixing that a later generation of Tutsis could be Hutu and vice versa. That's why experts say that these two cannot truly be considered two separate ethnic groups. I think that's the correct translation. However, the difference between these two, whatever we call them, is clear linguistically and historically. Tutsis were pastoralists and Hutus were farmers, and this was a source of inequality. Livestock was more valuable property than crops, which is why the name Tutsi gradually became synonymous with the elite, the superior political and economic class. This situation intensified in the late 19th century, and its socio-economic meaning gradually overshadowed its initial racial meaning. Physical distinctions and colonial influence now. It's interesting that they also say that their physical characteristics differ, although there are exceptions. But typically, Hutus have darker skin, more prominent lips, a rectangular jaw, a plump nose, and a round face. Tutsis, who were shepherds and cattle owners and more affluent, had more elongated faces, narrow noses, thin lips, and smaller jaws. Of course, many say these things have no basis, and exceptions are countless. But these likely unfounded distinctions could mean the difference between life and death during the genocide. Another very important point is that the Europeans who arrived in Rwanda in the late 19th century depicted the society there according to these same stereotypes. That is, they drew people with the physical characteristics we mentioned for Tutsis in their paintings, and said that these people were ruling and commanding people with darker skin who were generally planting bananas and were farmers. That's why they thought this was the natural order of things. Colonial legacy and heightened tensions. Colonialism in Rwanda began with the Germans. They came first and made the Tutsis rulers over the Hutus, the class they considered more elite economically. After World War I, when the Belgians replaced the Germans with the help of the Catholic Church, they dismantled the remaining independent Hutu structures. Then the Belgians intensified this situation in a very dangerous way, stating that they must issue identity cards to all residents of the country, on which it was written whether the person was Hutu or Tutsi. This way, they effectively enabled the organization of an apartheid system, and it became impossible for Hutus to become Tutsis. Then, gradually, at the encouragement and instigation of European colonizers, the Tutsi elite, from their state of self-importance and self-superiority, slowly entered the realm of racial supremacy. Naturally, at the same time, a reaction to this sentiment formed on the other side. As calls for independence arose in Africa, Hutu power became the voice of the struggle against oppression and for independence in Rwanda. In 1959, when the situation became chaotic and violent, the Belgians, who were themselves leaving, began to support the Hutus, reversing their previous policy. After the departure of the colonizers, something happened in Rwanda that we have seen in other similar countries. A new group came to power. A shift in power, but they used the same oppressive relations this time against a group of their own compatriots. That is, the Hutus who had now come to power began to oppress the Tutsis, even though it was the colonial era. Of course, France also replaced Belgium during this period, and they allied with the Hutus, making Rwanda their sphere of influence. All the while, even during the genocide, they supported the established government, even sending weapons, providing diplomatic assistance, and giving refuge to these Hutus. And even later in exile, they continued their support for them. Even in late June 1994, when the RPF had already won, France sent a humanitarian army from Zaire to help its allies, although they were unsuccessful. Warnings and massacres. We mentioned that the clamor for killing Tutsis started from the media and government officials in the early 90s. By 1990, a large number of these Tutsis were displaced outside the borders of Rwanda. Rwanda is one of the most densely populated areas in Africa, and the government claimed, "We don't have enough space for all of them to come home." 95% of the country is under cultivation. The average family has 8 members and lives and farms on less than 3 hectares of land. The fact that a group of the population was pushed to live outside the country helped them, for example, those in Uganda, to form the core of this Rwandan Patriotic Front. In October 1990, the RPF attacked Rwanda. The government used this as an excuse to begin widespread arrests of political opponents, including Tutsis. A week later, the first massacre of this genocide occurred, in which 350 Tutsis were killed in one place. Then the 10 Commandments of the Hutu were issued. For example, Article 8 stated that Hutus should have no mercy on Tutsis. The president also gave a speech saying that we are all responsible for cleansing these evils, each and every one of us. He also referred to some myths that said the original Tutsis migrated to Rwanda from Ethiopia and said that they should be thrown into the river and returned to where they came from. The absence of a central figure. One strange aspect of the Rwandan situation is that there is no Pol Pot here, no mafioso organization. It's interesting how every report I've recently covered on channel Narra refers to a mafioso organization. In mafioso organizations, they say that someone who dedicates themselves to the gang no longer belongs to themselves. Both this point and the hierarchical structure of mafia networks are seen in Rwandan society. At the top of the pyramid sit the Hutu power oligarchs, which essentially means the president, his family, his business partners, and his military allies. Of course, Rwanda was not one of those ownerless enclaves or failed states in Africa. It had a very successful government, but the point is that everything seemed to culminate with the president. However, when this person was removed and we saw that this was truly the beginning of the genocide, no one replaced him. No one took his place. The president's assassination was, in all likelihood, the work of the Hutu power extremists themselves. As soon as the plane crashed, the central airport from which anti-aircraft missiles were being fired was closed, preventing the UN or other international bodies from investigating the incident. But regardless of who killed him, after he was killed, no central figure for the genocide emerged. There was no Hitler, no Stalin, no such person. The list of important individuals who were investigated after the genocide includes government leaders and officials, military personnel, businessmen, mayors, journalists, civil servants, grocers, taxi drivers, artisans, all kinds of people. It was as if everyone acted at the appointed time according to a long-practiced plan, and the main goal of that plan was to make the operation appear unplanned. Religious sanction and political denial. 5 weeks after the president's killing, a religious leader also claimed that he had a dream and that the Virgin Mary told him that he would be in heaven with her. This was enough for the religious and Catholic community to accept this as proof that the Tutsis had killed the president. Among those the writer visits is someone who became president after this man, and is now the head of the government in exile in Zaire. This means in 1995 he tells the writer, "We Hutus are oppressed and innocent. This is all just northern propaganda." He then recounts a trip he made to his hometown 2 weeks after becoming president. In that town, the local governor was not in favor of the genocide, so the people did not harm the Tutsis for the first few days. Even Tutsis from other cities sought refuge there. Then this gentleman went there and gave a speech, "O people, rise up." Afterward, Paramilitary forces were brought in by bus with weapons and tools, and they swept through the town. The local official who had given refuge to the Tutsis was dismissed, and within 2 or 3 weeks, 55,000 people were killed in that town. One of the most horrifying massacres occurred there. Evasion of responsibility. Now the writer says he asked him about it, and he said, "My mind went blank. What did I say?" If local officials say they killed on my orders, they are wrong because they should have been responsible for their own area. If they carried out the massacre on their own initiative, that was also wrong because massacre is a bad thing. He said to him, "Sir, as you say, you were president, you were a doctor, and you saw them killing. Why didn't you intervene?" He says, "I will answer that question in court if necessary." This report, as we mentioned, was written in 1995 when the events of the genocide were still fresh. I will not refer to subsequent events so as not to disrupt the narrative flow. I am only recounting the report that was published at that time. If anyone wishes, they can go and read it. There is a great deal of material about the Rwandan genocide. The Wikipedia page itself is very rich. Many documentaries have been made about it. Good films, good books have been written. I am just recounting this report. The unforeseen outcome and its aftermath. The writer says the irony of the situation is that this genocide ultimately brought the Tutsis to power, something they had never imagined or prepared for. After the RPF came to power, about 800,000 displaced Tutsis returned to Rwanda, almost the same number as those who had been killed. However, the enemy had not been defeated, they had only fled. The country was devastated and empty, and the enemy was behind the borders. The situation was very fragile, and it seemed very favorable for this new government to be pushed towards violence, extremism, and revenge. In the new government, many officials were again from the Hutu community. However, a very important thing they did, for example, was to invalidate those identity cards, which had become death tickets during the genocide. When the writer was there, he says 60,000 people had been imprisoned for participating in the genocide. He says he asked one of these officials, "Sir, you've arrested so many people, put so many people in prison, what's going on?" He said, "Look, if 1 million people were killed here, who killed them?" I said, "Well, many people killed them. Many people were involved in this." He said, "Have you seen anyone yet who says, 'Yes, I killed. I participated in this massacre'?" I said, "No. Everyone I've talked to in prison has said they weren't involved at all." He said, "Yes, that's why we arrested them. After all, a society is responsible, and these people are responsible in that society. They must answer." He added that they primarily arrested them for their own protection. If they were outside, people would tear them apart. Justice and reconciliation in a ravaged land. This statement was not entirely unreasonable here. In the following weeks, several freed Hutus were killed. One was burned in their home with his wife and children. Another was shot on the street and killed, then thrown into a banana field. That's why some Hutus themselves say they are more comfortable in these small prisons. Prisons built for, say, 750 people now hold 6,000 people. 4 prisoners per square meter. The conditions are terrible. Pollution, swollen limbs, no sleeping space, no toilets, worse than imaginable. But it's not clear what the government wants to do with them. The judicial system is paralyzed. There is no money, no judges, no lawyers. Everyone is either dead or imprisoned. And it's impossible to hold 60,000 murder trials. Such an undertaking is too demanding to implement. And politically, it's not the right thing to do, even if it might be fair and just. This government official tells the writer, "Look, genocide happened here. The answer is that justice must be served." Rwanda also has the death penalty, which means we are talking about the killing of tens of thousands more people, which is truly not the way to go. alternative paths to justice and the failure of the international community. The way this government has found to escape this quagmire is to say that this genocide was orchestrated by masterminds and carried out by slaves. That is, it separates the instigators from the perpetrators. It says that no one is innocent, but if it is a political crime and we want its punishment to achieve political goals, this punishment must distinguish between the masterminds of the crime and the instruments of injustice. He then says, in our agricultural peasant society, if someone commits a theft or a crime, they are brought before everyone and then they pay. A fine, confess, express remorse, pay a fine, for example, give some salt, are punished, and then go about their business. They talk about themselves afterwards. But killing the killer, for example, does not compensate for anything. It is fear and anger that are released, but a fine can compensate. For example, by being fined to work for the government for free for a period. The government also needs labor. This way of thinking has a strong resemblance to denazification in Germany after the war, and the method implemented there after the Nuremberg trials following World War II. However, the fundamental difference is that, firstly, justice there was established by foreign occupiers, and secondly, and far more importantly, in Germany, the survivors of the victims were not supposed to face each other after the tragedy. They went on with their lives. They went somewhere else. In Rwanda, it's not like that. Their lives are too intertwined to be separated. This makes the situation of Rwandan society after the genocide very complex. The government asked the UN and the Security Council to help apprehend and try these fugitives. At that time, the Security Council was grappling with the war crimes in former Yugoslavia. In its statements there, it added Rwanda everywhere under Yugoslavia, meaning it didn't take these issues very seriously. Also, international courts do not satisfy them much. As one of them said, firstly, if that court cannot issue a death sentence, then it's useless. And then, if someone is convicted in court, they want them to be imprisoned in Sweden, where they have television and amenities. This is not justice. This is very different from our concept of justice. That's why they said, we want this international court you want to hold to add the death penalty in honor of Rwanda. The Security Council responded, we won't cooperate with you. We recommend that you also remove the death penalty from your own laws. They said, sir, this is like insulting us. What do you mean? It's a bitter recommendation. A genocide happened here, and then you want us to remove the death penalty when we hold a court. Do you even understand what you're saying? There is a general perception, both in the writer's report and elsewhere, that the international community gravely failed Rwanda both during and after the genocide. During the genocide, the Clinton administration in the U.S. instructed officials not to use the term genocide for the events in Rwanda, even though there was a possibility that acts of genocide were occurring. It seems their main concern was that recognizing genocide would have consequences they didn't want to bear. The UN forces there also had a Canadian commander who said, I need 5,000 to 8,000 troops to stop this slaughter. However, in practice, the Security Council, I need forces to stop this slaughter, but in practice, the Security Council even reduced the 2,000 troops this guy had to 270. This means they effectively didn't do what seemed possible to prevent the genocide. Later, when they rushed into Rwanda for humanitarian aid after the event, they realized that all they could do now was bury the bodies and stabilize the situation of the refugees, most of whom were incidentally the Hutu perpetrators of the genocide who had now fled to Zaire, Kenya, Tanzania, and Burundi. They themselves, of course, say that they must adhere to the principle of neutrality. It was a very difficult decision. We know that among the people we are serving here, there are those who were involved in this genocide, but our system is one of humanitarian and neutral aid. This tribunal, as one official put it, is a way for the international community to satisfy its conscience, that although we could not act according to the convention and prevent the genocide, at least we did something. But the problem is that what they did was probably worse than doing nothing. Concerns for future conflict. At the end of this report, the writer expresses his concerns that the situation will lead to another war. And he says that this seems to be the Hutus' clever plan, because when war happens, the memory of this genocide gradually fades. New events come to the forefront. Everyone is fighting everyone else. Who can take whose side in this chaos? He says it seems the planners of the Rwandan genocide understood very well that the favored position in the international community is one that allows for the claim of neutrality. That's why they're playing it well. Then the writer says, yes, many are worried that this incident will lead to a regional war, and Zaire, Tanzania, and Burundi will also be drawn into the conflict, a war this time with genocide as its pretext. This means that this minority government, whose legitimacy is derived from the victimization of the genocide and whose mindset is military, not social or economic, only military, will enter into war. As a Red Cross official put it, the conditions that this government faced in Rwanda after the genocide are very similar to Israel's, both in terms of the source of legitimacy, which is victimization, and in terms of having a military mindset. A sister's tragic story. One of the people the writer had previously interviewed for this report visits him in his last days there and says, "Come to my house, I want to tell you a story." The writer says, "I knew his sister had been killed in the genocide, but I didn't know the details." He says, when he went there, the man told him that his sister's husband was a very religious man. When they came for them at their house, he said, "Let me pray." He prayed, and then he said, "I don't want you to butcher my child and my family members." They said, "Okay, then throw them into this septic tank alive yourself." So he threw them in, and then he and his wife went in, and that was it. This man, Edmund, whose wife is German and whose wife and children live in Berlin, tells the writer, "It offends me when people come here and talk about reconciliation and forgiveness. Imagine coming to Jews in 46 and telling them to forgive. Forgive what? The issue is still raw." He says forgiveness is, firstly, a personal and private matter, and secondly, it needs a lot of time to become possible. He says, "Besides my sister, I also lost a brother. I know his killer. I've seen him on the street once or twice. I want to talk to him. I want to go and see what was going through his head at that time. I don't want him to go to prison. I want him to be outside, but I want this fear, this mental torture, to always be there. I want him to be tormented by the thought of what he did for the rest of his life." Cain and Abel. A parallel, this story of someone committing murder and then living in perpetual torment, reminds the writer of the story of Cain in the Torah. It's very interesting. We said that the Hutus who committed genocide were farmers, and the Tutsis who were killed were pastoralists. This is similar to the story of Cain and Abel. Cain, according to the Bible, was a farmer, and Abel was a shepherd. Both offered sacrifices to God, Cain from his produce and Abel from his flock. And among them, Abel's sacrifice was accepted by God, and Cain was upset and killed Abel, and then this pain and torment stayed with him forever. Edmund says, "I want my brother's killer to be like Cain, the man who built the first city. And although we don't like to remember it much, in fact, we are all his descendants." The book and the podcast Music. He also wrote a book with the long title, "We wish to inform you that tomorrow we will be killed with our families," which won several awards. The point I must emphasize here is that the Rwandan genocide, like many other historical subjects, has controversial aspects on which not everyone who has studied it agrees. Their differences and contradictions form a picture of reality for us. I recounted this report as an example and an introduction to familiarize ourselves with the subject, and of course, it's a very, very good report. The scope of this report was more about the overall subject. In this last part of the podcast, I've dedicated a short section to describing another report that was recently written 2 years ago. This one goes to individuals, a closer look at the story. It found 4 people involved in the incident and told their stories. And through their stories, we gained some understanding of the situation of this society after the genocide. Of course, I have summarized this report very briefly for recounting here and describing it. Truly doesn't do it justice because it is a multimedia report with many photos and videos. And the text of the report is actually written interspersed with them. Watching them together is a very good experience. I recommend you definitely check the original source. Innocent Keger's Story, a report titled Love for My Enemies, was published by the Atavist magazine online. The report was produced with the support of the Pulitzer Foundation. The person who took the videos in it later made a documentary with them, which can also be found now. But I really recommend watching this Atavist report. When the Rwandan genocide began, Innocent Kagor lived in Kigali, the capital of Rwanda. He was a 24-year-old Tutsi from a village not far from the capital. When he was a teenager, his father left them, and he came to the city to try and make something of their lives there. His job was selling milk, but he was also taking driving lessons so that he could also work as a driver on night shifts later. The beginning of the horror, we've talked about how the genocide began. The Hutus themselves killed the president, and they took a hit list that had been prepared long before and started going after people. In fact, a few hours after the president's death, Hutu thugs poured into the streets and started showing off. Innocent immediately realized that things were bad and started walking towards his village, 35 kilometers from the capital. When he arrived there, he saw that his family had emptied the house and taken refuge in the church. The mayor, who was Hutu himself, had promised that Tutsis would be safe in the church. He slept in his house that night, and then the next morning he got up and hid in a banana field. He was in that field for 9 days until a group of Hutu thugs found him there. It turned out that a childhood friend of his named Valers, who was Hutu, had given them his information and sent them after him. They didn't kill him, but they beat him so badly that the scars remained on his face and body. He stumbled and dragged himself to the city and to that church where tens of thousands of people had gathered. Tens of thousands of people were in the compound of a rural church, many of them Innocent's friends and relatives. The church massacre and its aftermath 2 weeks after the start of the genocide. On April 20th, Hutus came to this town, to this village. First, they killed the mayor, who was Hutu but had given refuge to these people in the church. Then they poured into the church. The sanctuary quickly became a death trap. With guns, grenades, and machetes, in successive waves, something between 20 and 45,000 people were killed there. Innocent was severely wounded again, but he was one of the few people who survived among those bodies. Regarding the rate of killing during the genocide, we mentioned something in the first report as well. Here, there's a calculation that says at the peak of the genocide, 6 people were killed every minute, often by their neighbors. After the events ended, in the villages and small towns, these people saw each other every day on the street, in the market, on the land. People who tried to kill each other now had to learn how to live together. Valler's story and the pain of forgiveness. Now let's hear a bit from Valler's, Innocent's friend, the one who, as we said, betrayed him. He says, "The first thing I heard about the genocide was on the radio, saying, 'Yes, you know, Tutsis are buying tanks to throw Hutus alive into hot oil.' He says, 'I was a kid and I thought, these Tutsis are such deceivers. They're my friends, but they're not telling me anything about these plans.' Then, when the Hutus started burning houses, he says, 'At first, I didn't understand what was happening. I thought it was a fire, and I started helping. Then these Tutsi neighbors fled towards the church, and someone pulled him aside and said, "Come on, why are you running? Look, not all houses are on fire. Only some houses are burning. Only Tutsi houses. We are safe. Stay." He says, "So I stayed, and then I joined them. Let's go back to Innocent." Innocent says, "After the genocide, wherever I went, I saw these perpetrators. Valers went to prison for 13 years. Then he was brought to a local court where he confessed to his role in the massacre and was sentenced to the same amount of time he had already served, 13 years, and then was released." This was the reconciliation policy the government had adopted. They didn't retry them after prison, they just released them. A difficult road to reconciliation. Many Tutsis, including Innocent, were disgusted by this policy. They said, "If the government told us to kill the perpetrators, we would have certainly killed them on the spot. But when I saw Valers in court, how difficult it was for him, I didn't know what to say anymore. I wasn't so opposed to the reconciliation policy anymore." Valers also says, "When I came out of prison, I was afraid of my neighbors. I wanted to go and talk to Innocent. An opportunity arose once, but no matter what I did, I couldn't say anything to him. We had a normal conversation. How are you? And what's new? And so on." Innocent doesn't know that Valers himself was among those who came to the banana garden, pulled him out, and beat him. He thinks that Valers only betrayed him. But finally, one day in 2011, Valers says, "I found the courage to go and confess my actions." I went and talked to him. Then they went together to a program that a Rwandan named Christophe had started to promote this culture of reconciliation and forgiveness between perpetrators and victims. They registered. Christophe is also an interesting person. He says, "When I saw that the UN had set up this tribunal to try the perpetrators, it disgusted me." He said, "The UN had the chance to prevent the genocide. It could have prevented it from happening." The organization that had even withdrawn its peacekeepers from the region and allowed this genocide to happen, they are the first ones who should be put on trial. Now they are coming and giving us advice. He says, "This is very painful. You left us to die here, and now you come and give us advice." Therefore, he says, "I came to the conclusion that we Rwandans ourselves must learn to cope with this issue somehow. We must find a way." The power of shared experience, that's why he says he founded this non-profit organization. He created an organization that brings victims and perpetrators together. They work very carefully and methodically. They plan several sessions privately, then with 2 people. Then gradually they come before a workshop in front of everyone. Valers apologizes to Innocent, who hugs him and says, "Let's go have a drink together." Then Valers gradually gets closer to Innocent, and he even tells him who killed his brother. Now their friendship has grown even stronger than before. As they say, "Our friendship is stronger than before the genocide because back then it was only based on childhood memories and such. But now we share something deep and dark." Christophe's organization also gave them a cow to take care of together. A cow was a symbol of wealth there. During the genocide, Hutus were told, "Kill the Tutsis, their cows are yours." Claudine's journey towards forgiveness. Another person who is lying among the dead in the church that day is a woman named Claudine. She also goes to Innocent. It turns out that she had come to the church with her child and brothers. Her husband was outside. Her child started crying, and her child was killed in her arms in a very brutal way. She fainted. Then her brother, who also survived, came and pulled her out. They found her husband, and he took her to the hospital. She ultimately survived, but after some time, she separated from her husband. A few weeks later, her husband was also killed. Her brothers were also killed in another terrifying incident. Her brothers were taken to a banana field and buried alive there. One of the Hutus who buried them alive and stayed there for 3 days until he was sure they had suffocated was a man named Ananias. Ananias participated in a total of 8 murders. But he says that killing this brother made him put down his machete. He felt as if he was shedding his own blood. After the genocide, he and Claudine lived near each other. After several stages of effort and sessions, Christophe succeeded in convincing Claudine to see him. 2 decades after the genocide, in 2013, there is also a very moving video of one of their initial meetings. And a few months later, their first session finally takes place in Christophe's workshop. Of course, the history between them is so heavy that it's really impossible to overcome the obstacles between them in 1 or 2 sessions. But after several months of sessions and discussions, Christophe for the first time publishes a photo of these 2 people, both smiling in the same frame. Claudine told Ananias that she had forgiven him, but on the long road to reconciliation, this is only the first step. Support Channel Narra. What you heard was episode 14 of Channel Narra podcast. Channel Narra is produced by Ali Bandari with the help of Namlik. To stay updated on the latest news and subjects of previous Channel Narra episodes, visit our blog or follow Channel Narra on Facebook, Twitter, or Telegram using the handle @ChannelBodcast. Don't forget that the Channel NARA fundraising campaign started from the moment this episode was released, and we are waiting for your help. In the past year and a half, Channel Narra has produced 20 podcast episodes. To produce Channel Narra with the same high quality and publish it a bit more regularly, I need to get help from others. The quality level of this work is such that doing it and putting it together is no longer a one-person job. The point is that for this work, you can't rely on volunteer and friendly help, because volunteer help is sometimes there and sometimes not, and this causes disorganization and wasted energy. And it's not very sustainable for keeping the Channel Narra podcast a long-term project.